Thanks very much for coming. I think we're just about all here by the look of it. There's not too many stragglers coming in. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming tonight, and welcome to a night in the John Oxley Library, where we're sitting in a nice example of a new building that's incorporating an old one, because you may or may not be aware that the old State Library that used to be here, the one designed by Robin Gibson's, still here within the library complex that was redeveloped about 8 years ago. So there's this evolution of buildings, and really across my shoulder here you can see the evolution of the city as well. Some buildings become extinct, but often and preferably old buildings, heritage buildings, remain and evolve for new purposes. And when it's done well, it really builds on the fabric of a community. The architecture that surrounds us is really important for that sense of place. It's what makes us love a city or a town like Brisbane. And when we look across the river here behind me, we can see examples of it. It's not just the skyscrapers and the pretty lights, but that layer of heritage and history beneath it. You can see right there along the river. Tonight we have, I suppose you could call them pioneers of heritage architecture in Queensland in preserving and interpreting that sense of place. Richard Allom and Desley Campbell-Stewart have been instrumental in preserving and designing a wide variety of Queensland buildings all around the state, and buildings really, mainly across the top end of Australia, but also overseas. And both Richard, of course, and Desley have a long association with the various incarnations of Allom level architects, which is a practice that's sort of synonymous with conservation architecture. So if you think of an iconic building in Queensland, Lovell Architects probably had something to do with it. The 4X Brewery, the powerhouse at New Farm, the old Jimbour homestead, Greenmount homestead near Mackay that I'm familiar with, the town hall at Innisfail, the Rocky Post Office, and even Mawson's Hut in Antarctica. It's a pretty impressive resume. More than 2,000 reports and conservation plans for buildings across the country, but mainly Queensland and the Northern Territory, and a lot of that is stored here now. 80 linear metres, I'm told, of documents and archives. A lot of material at the John Oxley Library, and some of it's on the table over there. There's some really impressive, it's almost art. Well, it is art, the drawings, but even the wallpaper and the linoleum, just beautiful. So that's part of a big collection of material from Richard Allom Architects from the firm's beginnings in 1976 until it closed in 2012. So, as an historian myself, I'm interested in those heritage reports, especially about historical buildings and places, and the architectural drawings, as I say, could be considered works of art. So Richard and Desley have been part of the soul of conservation architecture in Queensland, and it's nice to think some of the buildings we appreciate today are still here with their help. But as a society, we really didn't start appreciating and rethinking the uses for our heritage architecture until, I remember I was up in Mackay in the 1980s. The 70s and 80s were really the start, were they, Richard, of this, I suppose, appreciation of our architectural past?
I think that appreciation has been growing slowly, but it received an absolute boost with the Labor government of Gough Whitlam, who recognised that something had been missing in previous governments, and he introduced a national study. I think Justice Hope chaired that, the inquiry into the national estate, and started to fund organisations like the Trust in various states, and from there the community started to come on board. It wasn't too hard to get the community on board. It was an idea, I think, whose time had come.
So it wasn't just Whitlam alone, it was a whole series of events that coincided, was it, with the 70s?
It was, and it wasn't just in this country. The idea of heritage was a baby boomer middle class idea that happened in the entire Western world.
Right, when the baby boomers were really just becoming adults and starting to change their world.
Well, I think the baby boomers like to take a different view for their parents, and this was one way of doing it.
So your career started in the 70s, so you're a man of your time, weren't you? I'm always interested as to why people choose the careers they did. Why architecture for you?
I've often wondered that. I must have known it from quite a while. I was a very poor student in my secondary education and did everything possible thing to avoid work. But somehow I must have wanted to be an architect because the school I was at didn't do two of the prerequisites to get into architecture, but geometrical drawing and perspective and art. And I took myself down to, it was probably in those days, it was the Central Technical College, to do both of those things to enable me to get into architecture. But I think architects just happen that way. I mean, Desley can tell you a story how when she was watching television as a girl, she would watch situation comedies and draw the floor plans from the two-dimensional image on the screen.
Is that right, Desley? How did you become an architect? What happened?
I wanted to be an architect from about the age of 5, I suppose.
Gee.
And that's just always what I wanted to do. But I had a father who was a quantity surveyor and a lecturer at university, and we would just spend all of our lives looking at buildings as a family. So you are led certain ways, I think.
Yes.
And I love drawing, and and it's been a lovely thing to do.
So as young architects, what made you want to look at old buildings? What drew you to heritage?
You want to start?
Well, again, it was an idea his time had come. I came back from Melbourne, and Victoria, of course, had the first heritage legislation in Australia, and again there was a general awareness of what was going on. I wasn't working in heritage in Melbourne. I was working in university planning, education planning, and I came back here for family reasons. And Don Watson, who I'm sure is here, said, I've got a job for you. And he took me to the National Trust and introduced me to Peter Forrest, who was the director at the time. And with a bit of negotiation, Peter Forrest said, start work tomorrow. And I did.
And what work were you doing with the National Trust?
Even in those early days, it was survey work. On the first day we left here, Peter Forrest must have been a full-time employee. Janet Hogan was the historian, the full-time historian. I came in as the architect. The three of us sat in one room in Old Government House. The day we started work, we got in the Falcon motor car and drove to Maryborough to look at a series of projects up there, and I just wrote little reports about everything along the way. It was information gathering, and there was plenty of information to gather. You could stop almost anywhere and see things. I knew nothing about it. I knew nothing about heritage, and I kept protesting that I knew nothing about heritage. Let me tell you, the first job we saw in Maryborough was a house called Eskdale House, still there, still on the register, big 2-storey Victorian pile. And we went in there, and probably the same man who owned it, Peter Holtorf. And he took us around the back of the house and showed me this enormous 2-storey rising damp going up at least 2 levels. Now, I knew nothing about rising damp. I bought a house with rising damp in Brisbane, but I knew nothing about rising damp. So I started to wax lyrical about how we should cut some drains and a bit of damp-proof courses or whatever. And Dick Stringer, photographer, a wonderful photographer, was also with us on that day, and he did a very Dick Stringer thing, and he said, if I were you, he said, I'd just learn to roll with the punch. Which I thought was terrible advice to give someone. But in the last 40 years, I realised he was absolutely right. There is no cure for rising damp, and I hope Peter Holtorf has learned to roll with the punch.
And some of the scars, the wall wounds that these old buildings suffer are part of the charm after a while. How do you decide what to preserve and what to fix and what to change, and how do you make those decisions? Because the National Trust is a purist organisation, aren't they? And you've sort of branched out since then, and you're preserving buildings for new uses. Where do you draw the line about preservation, heritage?
I think the whole concept of heritage has moved dramatically from 76 right through. And part of that move was an organisation called ICOMOS, which was an International Council on Monuments and Sites. There's an Australian chapter who was very strong and spent an extraordinary amount of time and effort in putting together the principles to address just that question. What's significant about a place is the critical. Long before you make decisions about what's to be kept, you have to ask what's significant. Often the ugly, the early adaptations, the changes that have been made are seen to be significant and need to stay. The days of bringing something back to, you still hear this awful term in television, restored to its former glory, which is the last thing that heritage is about and hasn't been about for the last 30 odd years at least.
Because we were speaking there about Maryborough, and Maryborough is an interesting, well, it's one of the most fabulous towns for Queenslander heritage in Queensland, but it was preserved because of almost we spoke about this before, it was never a rich community, unlike places like Mackay, Cairns, where enough money could be spent to renovate and restore or pull down and build flats. Maryborough was saved because it was never quite that rich. So when you went to Maryborough, firstly, what sort of treasures did you find? What was there? And what's still there? Has that changed since the 70s?
I think, well, taking it in order, what was there was wonderful, and the well-known buildings. There's the government precinct, there's Geraghty's store, the big houses, the timber merchant Hines house, and so forth. All there, and all fairly well known today on the tourist trap. In the 1970s, there was value on every street corner. All the old houses, all the old shops were still there, all with their original paint colours or early paint colours. The city, the state, the country was so rich in small H heritage, and tragically, most of that has now gone. And it's not just Maryborough or this state, it's this country, it's the success of heritage has been, to a large extent, its own enemy. There's been money spent on properties and in many cases to save them, to keep them, to stop them being demolished or falling down. But in many ways, the real value of those places and those properties has gone and will never come back.
You mentioned before the importance of detail, and when places are often fixed up, a lot of those small details that mean so much are overlooked. And you spoke earlier about evidence of the tram signs in Brisbane back in the 70s. Yeah. So those very small details, what matters, not necessarily the whole building in its original condition.
That's absolutely right, and the example I gave of the tram sign, when I first came back to live in Brisbane, the corner of my street had a telegraph pole that was holding something up, and around the telegraph pole you could still see the faded red and white of an early tram stop. That had been stencilled or painted on the post. But even more exciting, as I took the children to school and whatever, underneath that was an enamel sign that said, "This is a war savings street." Now, there's no way that could have been listed or would have been listed, and I don't know if even with today's sensitivity, what would happen to it. You can't put it in a park. You can't, it's too big to bring to the library. These are things that disappear, but they're part of our heritage, and we really do need to consider these things as much as we consider town halls and cathedrals.
Desley, regional Queensland can be a pretty exciting place for an architect interested in heritage buildings, and as we've been talking about, it can also be a little depressing to see what's been lost. But you've been looking around regional Queensland for some time. What are your favourite places?
Probably my favourite place is Charters Towers because I've been working there for so long. I became the Heritage Advisor there in 1993. I was very young, and I'd go up there for 3 days a month. I did that for probably 15 years or so, and it's just a wonderful town, and wonderful because it didn't have a lot of money in the town. While there was gold mining that had come back to the town, that really hadn't had an impact on the main street. So there were interiors in buildings and interiors in shops up there that had survived in their original colour schemes. Pollard's store still had its little money exchange machine that would run up on this little hoist up to the central area where you'd pay your money. So all of those things still survived in town. And the nice thing about working in some of those sort of regional towns is that the people who live in the town love where they live and are really proud of it, and are more than happy to go along with ideas of how we can look after the place. Because in towns like that where there wasn't a huge amount of industry, they could see a future in tourism, and tourism for them meant retaining their historic buildings and making the place a nice place to visit. And they used to work very hard. I remember hearing stories about Ballarat many years ago and how they put in the Eureka Stockade event at Sovereign Hill. And the reason they did that was to try and get the tourists to stay for one more night, because if they could get everyone to stay one more night, that made such a difference to the economy of a small town. And Charters Towers did the same. I know we had a lot of funding that came through with the Heritage Trails Network some years ago, and they did some quite lovely work in restoring the Venus Battery and some of the old stock exchange in town. But they also did an event that went at night to try and get people to stay an extra night. But you know, we've worked in other lovely places like Blackall and Barcaldine and Ilfracombe, and you know, really terrific places. And again, places where the people who live there just love the places, and even the councils were pretty supportive in a lot of those towns. And
a lot of towns do have at least something remaining, don't they?
Absolutely.
We talked about the railway roundhouse in Rockhampton, for instance, that was preserved, but it was very close to being demolished. What happened there?
That was, and we've pulled out some drawings and photographs and perspectives there. The roundhouse was built probably just after the turn of 1900 and something or other, and it was a 52-bay railway locomotive workshop. So it was like Thomas the Tank Engine, but on a sort of a mega scale. And it was pretty unusual because it was one of the few, I think, the only complete roundhouse in Australia. Others had been built in Junee and other places, and they were partial roundhouses, so they hadn't finished building all the little fingers there. Queensland Rail, in their wisdom, thought that they'd actually like to knock that building down and to replace it with a 2-storey Besser block office building for some of the workers in a sort of what they used to call, when I was doing hospital design, they used to call it racetrack plans. It meant it had a central core in the middle of toilets and things, and then it had a racetrack of corridor, then it had rooms around the outside. And we actually worked with a fellow who was a project manager for Queensland Rail, who came in and said to us, look, you know, is there something you can do with this? And we said, well, yes, you can keep it and you can adapt part of it to be offices, and then you can keep part of it just as a lovely sort of ruin, untouched. You can turn part of it into a museum so people understand the place. You know, you can have a whole range of ways of dealing with this beautiful structure. And he said to us, he said, I'm sticking my neck out for you. He said, if you think you can do it, go ahead. So we did it, and it was a great project. You know, we inserted this little steel and glass building within the historic timber building, and it was just terrific.
And it works.
Oh, yes.
But so
absolutely.
To get that done requires somebody who's sympathetic, who's going to say, go for it.
Yep.
Because I imagine, does that happen often?
No.
No?
No. And it's a really nice thing. If you can find any client who understands where you think something can go and they let you run with it, it's just wonderful.
What other examples then? Because the powerhouse is an interesting example of a building that's, you know, its use is completely changed. Was that a similar situation?
Yeah, the poor old powerhouse, we were doing studies of that in the very early days when it was just a ruin and a graffiti-covered ruin. And they were ideas to turn it into an indoor sports centre. Remember that? To put swimming pools inside it, and quite different sort of feasibility options of what you do with this lovely ruin, which we thought was a lovely ruin. Other people didn't necessarily agree with that at the time.
Wasn't on the wasn't on any register.
No, it wasn't on any register.
And this is a good client argument. The good client argument. Somewhere in the council, someone said, well, we should do something sensible with this building. And another circumstance, someone would have said, knock it over in the middle of the night and we'll build a new swimming pool. Sorry.
No, that's right. But anyway, so we worked with the council, and there were a team of design architects, there was the city architects, and there was Michael Rayner and his team, and we worked very carefully to try and thread all those new theatres inside that existing structure. And we had constant debates about we were wanting to keep the broken glass that was all wired together in the windows, and there were some battles like that we didn't win. So we photographed those and used them in postcards for ourselves now, so we remember. But the graffiti was all retained, and I think the essence of it being a power station was pretty much retained. A ruined power station, yeah.
Because not all buildings survive, their clients. But
No.
they don't survive Queensland's weather either. And it's sort of interesting, isn't it, that we often have a rich heritage because of that climate, not just that style of architecture, but the diversity of architecture we've inherited in Queensland, often because, or anywhere really, is because of the weather, and often in Queensland it's cyclones, and in other states it could be, or other places in the world, earthquakes and bushfires. It changes. So the whole community has changed. But in Queensland, something significant happened when we had some big cyclones at the start of last century. Can you tell me a little bit about the Art Deco buildings that we have in a number of Queensland towns thanks to some cyclones?
But it's a very interesting history of Queensland if you track where the cyclones were and then the rebuilding that happened after those cyclones. And you can see a wave that went through Mackay and Innisfail and Townsville, and there are different little towns all the way up the coast, and you can just track them down to, oh well, that was the 1918 cyclone, and that was the 1920 whatever cyclone, and through to today. We were working a couple of years ago on the rebuilding of the Innisfail Shire Hall, which was blown, was severely damaged in that last, probably the cyclone before the last one. Up there, and that was an enormous Art Deco building, which had been built as a result of a previous.
So that's right.
Cyclone.
So there was a big cyclone in 1918 that destroyed Innisfail, and a cyclone in 1918 also did a lot of damage to Mackay.
It did, yes.
And both those towns have significant Art Deco buildings because of that.
Yep.
Interesting. I didn't realise that.
No.
I don't think it didn't occur to me.
No, and it's a lovely story, and there's also that story with those two towns because Mackay and Innisfail were just wealthy towns from sugar. And you had that lovely Maltese connection and the Italian through those areas. So you had different building styles there anyway. But there's absolutely, so Mackay, I know when I was working there as the Heritage Advisor, we were desperately trying to make the council and everyone aware that they actually were, all those Art Deco buildings, no matter how tiny they were, as a collection, were actually pretty important. And in fact, I think more important than the ones in New Zealand that everyone's taken to in, is it Napier? They're all dragged around there in historic cars wearing, dress-up outfits. I think Mackay has a fantastic collection of Art Deco buildings.
Oh, I sort of, because I've never been to Napier, I imagined it just solid Art Deco.
Not as good as, I think Mackay is better.
Like the Ambassador Hotel.
Yeah.
What are those hotels? The Mackay Hotel, the Ambassador Hotel, the Australian Hotel. They're all interesting.
The Pioneer Council Chambers.
Yes.
All of those. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And the Johnstonshire Hall then, it was reinforced concrete in those, of course. So it's interesting that the response was a fairly solid building in response to the cyclone. But I guess I imagine, the best material in the tropics is I always thought of as wood and, big verandas, but does the reinforced concrete work? I mean, I just imagine it's hot.
It did work, and the damage in whatever the cyclone name was, blew it away a few years ago, was really quite superficial. Windows were blown in, the roof was taken off, and so forth. And in rebuilding it, in repairing it, things happened that we weren't entirely happy with. For example, the upper level, the theatre, the dance floor, was originally an open dance floor, so that you could roll the big shutters back at night and the cool tropical air would come in. Well, because the engineers wouldn't wear that anymore. Once you've got an open window, the building's at risk. So eventually the building was rebuilt with windows, but I'm happy to say with shutters over the outside to look like it was still open to the cool tropical breezes.
Oh, it's a shame though, isn't it, that we have
Well, I
to
think
change
but again, another good client there. I mean, the interesting thing about clients is it's not a one-shot exercise. I mean, because we did so many reports over the years, many of our clients, many of who were sort of quite angry about having an historic building that needed some work on it, once the report was done, they'd come to you and say, I had no idea what this was about. It was part of that educative process that's happened over the last 30 or 40 years. And a lot of our reports have actually made that clear, not just to heritage councils and the National Trust, but to individual clients who've taken on board the idea that there is something quite special in their own building.
Do you have to keep educating people? I remember back in the 80s and 90s, heritage was a big thing. I was a member of the National Trust back then. And it was the big thing in Mackay, but that seems to have faded away a bit. You don't hear that much about the importance now of old buildings. Things are done to them almost automatically. I'm not quite sure what's going on. What is happening with heritage?
David Suzuki, the naturalist, was on an ABC program last year, I think the face-to-face program, and he was asked the same question: what happened to the environmental movement in the United States and worldwide? And he pointed out that we were just all too overconfident. We thought that every win was a step further that would never reverse. And none of us believed in the 1970s that the work we were doing on heritage and the education of the masses would ever be reversed. But once you take your eye off the ball, it's gone. And David Suzuki laments the fact that he didn't work harder at maintaining the progress that was made. And I think we can all lament the same sort of thing. It's partly it's natural. I mean, tastes and patterns run in cycles. But I think a lot of people today, many of our potential clients, just don't get what it is that the people in the heritage industry in those 40 years from the 70s onward were really trying to do.
So can you give me a couple of examples maybe in the last decade of things that could have been saved that weren't, that might be a source of regrets sort of generally for society, for architects? No, that's all right. But
and again, it's not it's not those major buildings that aren't saved. It's the subtle lack of understanding that happens. I mean, well, let me give you an example. I think that when the Brisbane City Council introduced the character zoning in Brisbane, that was a great step forward. The idea was that if a row of buildings, a row of domestic Queensland houses had significance in our understanding of the city. The David Malouf's picture of the elevated house and the dust falling through and the ant lions underneath and whatever. And it was a great success. There were some objections, of course, but by and large it was an enormous success. But I'd like anyone to take me to a street in Brisbane that is still as David Malouf saw it. All those houses that have been kept have been jacked up, enclosed underneath, extended out the back, decks facing west, southwest, any way you want, as long as we've got a deck. Superficially, Brisbane is still there. In a mist, we can squint at it and say, yes, this is wonderful. In heritage terms, I think we've lost a lot because we didn't actually understand what was significant about those houses.
Yes, because I lived in a street in Barden and it was all heritage listed, the whole street front. Having moved away the whole street. Well, many of the houses have changed, but a lot of the houses have had big, even though their heritage frontage still exists, they've had big double carports put in the front. But is that necessarily a bad thing? It's an evolution again of houses.
Yes, it's where we are. I mean, it's part of it's part of culture. It's what we are. People, no one will live in a small house anymore. We all want something larger. We want, every child has to have its own room. It's the way of the world, and it won't go back. And I don't mean to sound completely negative about it. I mean, I think Brisbane is really a very attractive city with its Queensland houses, and I don't mean to sound down on the whole system, but I do think that it's gone. And in contrast with your earlier question about what I saw in Maryborough on that first day with the National Trust, when it was just row upon row of brown houses and picket fences that were slightly leaning over and whatever. Not here anymore.
Air conditioning must have a lot to answer for, do you think? We all drive air-conditioned cars. I've heard the theory that since they put air conditioning in cars, we all insist on air conditioning our houses, and then it doesn't really matter what design the house is. It can face any way you want. You can just stick an air conditioner in it.
I remember we were working on Government House in Darwin some years ago, doing some advice for them on their interiors, and Adrian Welke from Troppo picked me up from the airport in this clapped-out old car. And Troppo are well known for doing wonderful tropical architecture in the top half of Australia. And he picked me up in this old car with the windows down, and I said, gosh, it's really, really hot up here. It was the middle of summer in Darwin. He said, yeah, he said, but that's all right. He said, you don't have anything air-conditioned in your life. He said, the minute you have your car, your house, or your office air-conditioned, he said, you can't live. He said, so you have nothing air-conditioned. So we went from his car to his office and then to his house. It was completely... And he said, this is the only way to live in Darwin. And they do these lovely, lovely buildings with louvers and ventilation and stuff. But that's a purist.
That's a purist, absolutely. Well, what other projects? We mentioned the Town Hall in Innisfail. What else? The Lockhart River Bark Church. There are a lot of gems still around that haven't changed.
Neither Desley or I have seen the Lockhart River Church. Lockhart River was an Aboriginal settlement in what era? 20s, 30s maybe, and the parish priest director there built a church. Now, first it was built from local materials, but it had an absolute architectural quality about it you couldn't miss. This wasn't just a lean-to on the side of the road somewhere. We were commissioned to do a study of this particular building, and we encouraged some of our staff members at the time, Michael Gunn and someone, I've forgotten who else, to go there. And I thought, well, it's a long way away. Really, I won't need to be there. Well, these boys came back after 2 weeks, and they'd had the best time. Not only had they written the report and conserved the building, but they'd been out with the local Aboriginal people hunting turtles and having the best time. The building itself is I think you could relate it to the Mawson Hut argument. It's so far away. Although the Lockhart River community who moved away from the coast, and then the women brought the young people back there to avoid some of the social problems at the mission. It's so far away from everything to look after the building, to service it, to deal with the argument that if no one sees it, is it worth keeping? It's the leaf in the forest argument, and it's very difficult. And I have no idea what's happened to the Lockhart River Church today.
I'll do some research.
I'll
get back to you. Because you mentioned Mawson's Hut there, and even though you haven't been there, although that'd be
another one I
interesting
missed
trip.
out. Although I did hear that the people who went were terribly seasick. I felt much better about that.
But you looked at that as well. What happened there? What was the original intention for
the huts had been there since Mawson abandoned them, and a group, I think largely volunteers, had taken it upon themselves to rescue the buildings, and they were deteriorating quite badly. It's known as the windiest place on Earth, and over the 50 years or so, the wind-driven ice and snow had eaten into these prefabricated timber huts. There was a proposal to move the whole thing, lock, stock and barrel, back to Adelaide, where the people could see it, where the cost of maintaining these buildings could be justified. And we weighed in and said, no, there's a sense of place that goes with these, and it's not just the frozen penguins under the eaves, and it's not just the pencil marks on the walls. These buildings belong where they are, and it was a long argument, but eventually our view prevailed, and the buildings are still there. There's a very nice display in Hobart, a reconstruction of the huts that's beautifully done, and gives people a much better idea of what it was like than bringing it back to Adelaide.
Because I suppose we have ruined the sense of place by moving buildings, and obviously Cook's cottage in Melbourne, they're sort of out of place. It doesn't sort of make any sense, really. And I also noticed that you did a study of the Wivenhoe Dam inundation area. I just wanted to ask you what was inundated. What was that about? Because obviously this is when Wivenhoe was being built, not inundation later from flooding. But behind Wivenhoe Dam, what was there?
Oh, you weren't there?
All my time.
Oh, yes, that's likely. It was vast areas of beautiful arable land were to be flooded, and the land had been taken up quite early, 1850s or 60s, and very early houses and barns and whole farmsteads had been built there. And again, the argument of not very much money comes into play. Largely they were still there. The farmers had passed it on to their children or died, but nothing had been, there was no broadacre farming. They were still small little settlements, and slab huts and elevated slab huts, and wonderful evidence of the evolution of the Queensland light timber construction, stumps set straight into the ground and squared at floor level, and what a lovely stuff. And we walked over that entire area for months at a time, writing down, measuring, photographing everything that was there. Now, as it happened, and rightly, nothing was saved. It was eventually all bulldozed and taken away before the waters came in. But the study itself is a lovely record of what was in the Brisbane Valley before that Wivenhoe Dam. And if nothing else was valued in the collection here, that's one of the key ones.
So it's worth reading those reports.
Well, I don't think it's reading.
How would you? But I mean, I am interested actually. I think it'd be lovely to.
Well, I have this sort of fantasy that future generations will say, that given everything else, every other house in Queensland has been elevated and filled in underneath. Here's a record of what was in southeast Queensland before that particular date,
I actually think, what year was that? Was that the early 80s, wasn't it, that was done? I think it's interesting that at that time that someone in some department said it's important that we record all of those places, because they could very well have just said the dam's going in and that's just what it is. But it's very interesting. It just takes a couple of people in any part of where you're working to say, no, this bit's important and we think we should record this, or we should photograph this. Or I know one of the things we sadly had to do quite a lot was to record buildings before they were being demolished, and those records were given to the Department of Environment, and they were also given to the John Oxley Library, so that we actually, for example, there was Block 10 at the Royal Brisbane Hospital. It was a lovely building, and knocked down, I think, to do the new children's hospital at some stage. So those buildings were measured, they were photographed, all of the lovely tiny details were photographed, because they're all the bits that made them pretty special. And thankfully they're all here now. And I see some of those are actually live on the collection here. You can actually dial in and have a look at the photographs live, which is pretty exciting.
Great.
But,
you know, you talked about the good client, and we've spoken a bit about the Queenslander house. What's the future, do you think? Or we don't build Queenslander houses much anymore. In some ways, they weren't really good for the climate. They were supposed to have been, but I remember living in a Queenslander on the stumps off the ground, and it was hot. I suppose I've got used to air conditioning. That's right. So that was a problem. Yeah. I guess that is the issue. But are we evolving still? Are we in the middle, perhaps, of another, design revolution we're not aware of? Were people, I suppose they were in the 20s and 30s aware of Art Deco, but we appreciate it more, perhaps, now than we did. Are we aware of what's happening now? Is there a style evolving? Do you see?
Well, there is. I mean, it's the light. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think you have to think of the Queenslander not as the sort of the heritage Queenslander that appears in all the streets that have been kept, but an idea. The idea that breeze is important, that orientation is important, and living outside is important. And I think there are young architects and not so young architects around Queensland who are doing that and doing it incredibly well. There are some very exciting tropical houses, not Queenslanders, but there's another whole generation coming through. Again, if people will accept that that's an important part of domestic life.
Yeah, it's education again, isn't it? Because I'd rather live in a nice house that's breezy. I noticed, because I lived in Mackay for many years, and I recall, and lived in Queenslanders in Mackay, but then the suburbs started to develop, and what happened was Melbourne-style houses, miles and miles of houses that are fully air-conditioned that aren't really suitable for the climate. I mean, something else could have been done there. Why wasn't it done? Why don't we think more about the houses we live in?
Well, I think it's just money. I mean, I'm as horrified as you are but the slab on ground. If you knew how difficult it was to put those stumps in the ground and get them level and to cut them off and to work at above ground, to pour a slab is so easy, relatively. So the house on the slab is clearly the accountant's way to do it. What horrifies me is to get an area of land level enough to pour the slab right through southeast Queensland. There are these amazing subdivisions with every allotment supported on a timber retaining wall. Now, it's not going to last. I mean, you don't need a sort of a postdoctoral study in timber decay.
Yeah.
They're going to drop,
Yes.
and that's the tragic to me. That and the black tiled roof. I mean, I drive. You drive up to the north coast and you look over those extraordinarily high fences, and all you can see are black concrete tiles. Now, again, I grew up with notes on the science of building that talked about reflection and breezes and whatever. Now, I don't know who's flogging. I don't know who's persuading people to buy black tile roofs, but it's a bit frightening.
I live in a 1960s house in the Gap, and it's beautifully 1964, designed I think by John Walsh, and breeze flows through it. I didn't realise it was 1960s. I thought it was fairly contemporary, but it was just a delightful house. Yeah, lots of lights and lots of air, and it had interesting little open areas, like almost inbuilt open areas that have since been closed in by previous owners, of course. But next door there was a block of land that had just recently been flattened, and up went a house fairly quickly with a black tile roof straight into the side windows. That's okay, but we just have to work our way around it. But 1960 seems to have come back a bit. I notice around me a lot of houses that are 1960s are being done up to look like Brady Bunch houses, and I actually quite like it. Yeah, they're nice.
60s houses are lovely. We're back to the Brady Bunch.
Well, life begins.
Mr. Ed was a difficult one, wasn't it?
Now, another one of your interesting projects, I guess the Birdsville Hall was something you designed from scratch, so it wasn't a heritage building but it was a building designed to fit into a heritage precinct, I'm assuming. Can you tell me a little bit about what went into that and how, I suppose, how you came to actually do that?
The Birdsville, I don't think we'd been in practice more than a month or 6 weeks, and I flew to Birdsville to look at a very beautiful ruin in the main street, the Royal Hotel. The Royal Hotel was then just, and there'll be photographs here somewhere, the most beautiful ruin. It was a ruin that had just collapsed in situ, so that every piece of shingle and every piece of timber had dropped as if it was just, no one had picked it up. It was just the most beautiful building.
Only an heritage architect could describe a building that had fallen down in such a lovely romantic way.
Anyway, these were the good old days, and I flew out there in a Fokker Friendship. The Fokker Friendship itself was an adventure near the Birdsville Hall, because in those days it was TAA, and Fokker Friendship was a small aircraft, and there was no first class and cattle class, and TAA in the good old days said, oh, in that case we'll make everything first class. So the drinks were on from the moment we took off from Eagle Farm Airport. We landed all the way up at every little country town. By the time we got to Birdsville, I was not as ready to do work as I should have been. The other wonderful thing about the 60s was that in those days there was no fence around the Birdsville airport. So the Fokker Friendship taxied right up to the door of the Birdsville Hotel. The stairs went down, and I came out wearing a suit, thinking I was, and from inside I could see people going like this, come on in. So they were fascinated that I was out there to look at the Royal Hotel, because like you, they thought, what is this pile of old stone in the corner? And David Brooke, who was chairman of the Shire, and probably still is, said, what are you anyway? I said, I'm an architect. So, what a coincidence. He said, we're looking for an architect.
He's a good client.
Before you go tomorrow morning.
He said you'll do.
He was spoiled for choice.
Anyway, they needed a hall. It was the days when the Birdsville races were picking up, and they had a tin shed across the road from the pub that was clearly inadequate. And we were commissioned to do some work, and I only realised tonight, looking at the drawings, we did 2 studies. One to adapt the original tin shed, which was effectively a shearing shed on steel poles, and the second scheme was one we did from scratch, and it was just a big tropical roof. I was right into climate. Again, the whole climate thing, and we turned the build. It was a big single roof. We turned its back to the hot winds, and proposed a big earth berm to throw the winds over the top of the roof. There was to be a fountain along the ridge to cool the building naturally without air conditioning. I can see you were warming to the whole thing. In Birdsville. And it was a lovely building, and apart from one little hiccup where I think David Brooke's wife said she really wanted one, having seen the drawing, she said she really wanted one that looked like the one at Dingo, and I found a picture of the one at Dingo, which was in fact a tin shed with a brick front, and I don't think I persuaded her that the right way to go. I think the other alternative for the client is to ignore their advice and instructions. So we built this building, and it was a lovely experience. We found a builder who had his own aeroplane, and the whole building was designed to 2 particular modules. One to fit on a semi-trailer, and the other pieces small enough to fit in the back of the builder's aeroplane. And the whole building was built, and you can imagine the difficulty of getting builders and trade skills and whatever out there. We had a lovely time, and we win a prize for that one? Yeah, I think we did. It was a nice building and a nice success. Although years later, they decided they wanted to air condition it, so we had to go back and fairly basic air conditioning. But
right, it sounds like you had a lot of fun.
We always had fun. We've always had fun. I'll tell you another story about the TAA and the Fokker Friendship.
Great.
There are no airline pilots here. the Fokker would go out on Saturday and come back on Sunday. So you'd be tipped out at Birdsville and the Fokker would go on to Alice Springs. Yes, Alice Springs, and then come back the next morning. And the flight would come in about 7 o'clock in the morning. So in the afternoons, being entertained by the local people, we had to get up really early in the morning to do the site inspection or whatever. Anyway, the last inspection I did, as I went to get back on the plane, the pilot said, "Nice to see you again." I said, "Oh yes." Well, I said, "Listen, this is my last trip out here as inspection. I'd really like to take a photograph of the building from the air, if that's all right. Can you tell me whether you'll be coming back over the town and whether I should sit on the left or the right of the aeroplane?" He said, "Sit there in the left-hand seat at the front and get your camera ready and never ever tell anybody what I'm going to do." And we took off and we circled way out into the desert and he came back, and as we came up to Birdsville, he tipped the plane to the left-hand side. I got such a fright, I only got one photograph. I thought we were going to our death. And then he levelled off.
Oh, was it in the collection? Do we have it over here?
I'm sure it is.
Have a look. Now, we've got some time for some questions. Any questions? Somebody? No? Yes? Oh, good. Yes.
Just wondering what your thoughts are on kind of more modern architecture. I've noticed in the UK there's a big trend to poured and polished concrete. So you have like a polished concrete floor and a poured concrete column, which is like in a cardboard caisson, comes out polished. And particularly like open ceilings for the services. Because they figure, oh, it's such a high ceiling, you're never going to look up in the ceiling and see all these horrible wires and pipes. And what do you think about that has to do with, like, say, the next 200 years, have all these ugly public buildings with polished concrete?
Sounds like the ABC, where I just come from.
Okay. I like polished concrete, and I think architecture is of its time. It tells the story about where we are at the moment. I think even and I think you see that in the listings that come through with the department and the National Trust. When we started in practice, the one building type that we thought was just nasty Brisbane were the 3-storey walk-up flats, the cream brick flats. But if you go back and look at those buildings now, some of them are quite clever, but they tell the story of what was happening in Brisbane in the 1960s, and I don't think we should just dismiss them and say, well, it's all to do with Victorian heritage or Art Deco work. I think we need to be really quite open about what we've got. Having said that, I think you need to be careful not to let down our guard architecturally. I think we need to be aware of who we are and where we're going. And I think discussing modern architecture and new architecture is terribly important from a heritage point of view as much as anything else.
Any other questions? Yes.
Your ideas on, you were saying, the building there, some ideas on how you can educate, what government could do to actually, beyond what they're already doing to gain the heritage of it.
Governments will only do what people want. So the short answer is we, the people, need to start talking about it again. It's very difficult because most people think everything is now okay. It's under the National Trust. It's an expression that used to be used. We won't worry about this particular problem because it must be done right. The Heritage Council is looking after it. It's on the Heritage Register. And it's clearly not true, and we do need to recognise where we are. I mean, we can't go back to the 60s. The building stock, the stock of heritage material has changed dramatically, but we do need to talk about it in terms of what we do. I mean, I think heritage has moved from individual buildings to a whole range of understanding now about what constitutes heritage. I mean, the ABC's history programs, I mean, almost every day there are people talking about what it means to do this or to be that or whatever, and I think we need to see that awareness. And the family history programs are enormous. I mean, libraries around the world having to rebuild themselves to deal with people who want to know what their grandfather's first name was. And we just need to build. We need to build that interest in our past and our heritage into the built environment at the same time, and in a gentle way.
So a program, for instance, where people could go, and I suppose you can really at Brisbane, although I've had problems with my own house, but you can go and research the history of your own house. That would create a lot of interest in, and perhaps publicise the ability to do that more.
I think they're all things that we've done over the years too. I think the trouble is, from what I can see, I don't think there are a lot of young people coming through the conservation world in Brisbane now. So, you know, where I came through when I was a student studying architecture and just always wanted to work with historic buildings, I don't see that number of people coming through now, and I think that's a real problem because, you know, we've given our collection to the library now, and the majority of the people who worked with us, who a lot of them are here tonight, are all of a similar generation and looking at retiring, and I don't know who's going to keep it going in that next generation. But it's a really important thing, but I know that, you know, the research in your house, the things that we all did 30 years ago. We had programs. The Queensland Museum used to run fantastic workshops. We had 500 people to one workshop one day down in the Queen. Do you remember that, Helen? And we had, you know, Ian Evans talking about buildings, Bob Riddell was talking, I was talking, you know, there was a whole core of people who were talking about different ways, and it was just a looking after your house series. But I don't think people are really interested in looking after your house in the way that, you know, that was like, you know, how you do colour scrapes and how you, now people want to paint their house white and make them look like, you know, the Renault Rumble or whatever the show is on television. You know, they want, you know, very beautiful white light fittings. But so I think things have changed, and I think, you know, that's not necessarily a problem, but I think that in fact it would be very good if there was more money going into architectural education to encourage people to be studying heritage and conservation. I know when I was going through, quite a few of us went over to York to study, and I don't know how many people do that now either, you know, but that was very much a material focused conservation program, which Queensland's never been very good at doing, you know, whereas I think in other parts of Australia, they do actually focus very well on stone conservation. In Melbourne, for example, and in Sydney, but probably in Melbourne more. I don't think we've ever been very good at doing that in Queensland. And that's in Brisbane, and then when you get outside of Brisbane, I think we're very poor at, you know, that sort of very careful, gentle conservation. I think we're still a fairly young state in our attitudes to historic buildings. And for example, you know, towns like Maryborough, they survive because of lack of money, not because of a want to make them survive. They just survive because, you know, no one had enough money to change them.
Take another question? Yes.
Well, I agree absolutely. We've sort of run out of competent tradesmen because, as Desley says, they're all older than me. I mean, they don't exist anymore. And they were wonderful people. but there's been no program to bring through apprentices. You get the odd one, but there is no trade training and no demand for it. I mean, I think this comes back to the question about, you know, if there was a demand for it, it would happen. If there was a requirement that corrugated iron roofs had to be refixed with lead-headed nails, we would soon discover that someone would make lead-headed nails and people would learn to drive a lead-headed nail instead of what happens now with long sheets and those electric drills with the little rubber grommet that keeps the water out. I mean, it's really a demand. But this comes back to Desley's point about the lack of interest in those things. I mean, you know, I've still got a jar of lead-headed nails at home in case the opportunity presents itself to use them. But most people won't entertain it. Now, does the Heritage Council say, and well, perhaps we come on to your first question about significance, is a roof so significant that it needs to stay in short lengths with lead-headed nails? Now, I think there are some that need that sort of care and attention, some places, some buildings that need that. It's only the department and the Heritage Council who can enforce that, I suspect, but it's not how we deal with heritage in this state. I mean, to be fair, I'm not sure that it happens in other states either. I think the whole community has grown and changed. We see heritage now as an idea rather than individual buildings. I mean, when I went to the United States on I think the Isolation tour, I went to Columbia University in New York. Now, Columbia University in those days had a heritage section that was so into technology, it was fantastic. They were analysing bricks. We were quite keen to analyse a bit of mortar in Australia. These people were cutting up bricks and working out what the composition of the clay was to put the bricks together. And the same with all those materials. I don't think that's ever really happened in Australia.
Look, I think we might leave it there, but if you have some questions, Richard and Desley will be here for a few minutes more. And go and have a look at the collection over there. I'm especially interested in the linoleum and the wallpaper. It's just fabulous. Please join me in thanking architects Richard Allom and Desley Campbell-Stewart. And feel free to pop up and ask some questions and have a look on the tables. Thanks very much for coming.
Can I just say before
Sure.
we go and have a look at the linoleum samples,
Yes, go.
this whole exercise happened against our... we were being very lazy about the whole thing. And taking material, we started to get rid of the stuff that we'd kept in an archive. And my old employer, Peter Forrest, who now lives in Darwin, persuaded Diane Byrne that there was stuff here that the library should be interested in, and after a lot of delays on our part, she came to our archive in Albion, and I thought she might take the photographs and some reports, and to her everlasting credit, she said, "I'll take the lot." And then the person who's really slaved over this for the last several years is Patricia Parr, who's done a lovely job, and I'm so excited to know that the collection has now been nicely catalogued and nicely kept, and I don't have to go to our own archive and think, I think there's a report about this in the third box at the top if someone can reach it down for me. So I thank the library for their commitment to our modest little collection. Thank you very much.